Great song. Thank you for leading us in that. It's not easy to begin again. We are and have entered into a new year. Entering into a new year kind of does that for us sometimes. We kind of look at that as being able to start over again. As you look up on the screen for the first thing here this morning, it's not easy, but I am glad that we can do it. There are so many times when, just in my walk with Jesus Christ, they just kind of sour somewhere along the way. It might be for a short time, might be for a long time. But I realize that something's not right. And I finally come to terms with that. And I finally come to Him and I tell Him, Lord, can we just delete that part of my life? Oh, this has just not been the way I've wanted it to be. I know it's not the way that it should be. It's not something that makes you happy. Can we just kind of delete that? I want to be able to erase that because I'm just so messed up about what's happening in my life. And so what God does, and again, I'm being kind of facetious here, but for all intents and purposes, what He does is He gets out His big eraser, or He hits that big divine delete button, and He says, yeah, we can do that. We can start all over again. But it's going to be a little bit more involved than what you think. A few weeks back, we started what we saw was the unfolding in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. If you want to open your Bibles to Genesis 6 there, we'll get there in a moment or two. We saw as an unfolding as God begins again, and He's beginning again on a worldwide basis. He's beginning again with planet Earth. Noah, in Genesis 6, is told the really bad news about this planet. All of the earth and all of its inhabitants are corrupt except you and your family. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to white it all out. I'm going to have to clean it all up with a flood, the total destruction of planet Earth. Again, look up on the screen. We're talking about the total destruction of planet Earth. How in the world do you prepare for something like this? How do you do that? How do you prepare when God takes a single life and He says, I'm sorry, but everything is going to have to be rearranged? We looked at the first of 3 steps a few weeks back before our Christmas break here and everything. There's 3 things, 3 ways that we need to prepare ourselves for, the 3 steps to get ready for something like this. Noah, on his behalf, was told to build an ark. This ark was going to be his refuge, and he did it. We know that there was no hesitation given this enormous task, and the reason why, no hesitation. He did it. He began to build it. Now, this in no way, the fact that he goes out and builds an ark in no way by itself explains, though, all of the other things that he's going to have to go through to get ready. So he's told to build this big ark, and we're going to look at the dimensions of this in the next couple of weeks here, and it's enormous. It's an enormous boat he's building. But it doesn't tell us all the other things that he would have had to do. He had to go out there and start collecting the material in order to build something like this, to start putting in place, carving it down, cutting things up. He'd have to begin to collect materials and supplies to take on board. We also discovered a few weeks back that his kids were really young. His kids were just being born at this time, so he's still got to be a dad, right? He has to raise his kids and everything. We also found out from the New Testament that Noah was a preacher. He was a preacher of righteousness during that time, so that means he was out there also connecting with people. Many of these people would be his friends. And I'm sure that he agonized at the resistance of some of these friends. I mean, he would have unsaved friends like you and I have unsaved friends. You have unsaved friends that I'm sure know where you stand and you know where they come from, and they don't agree with you and you can't convince them, but you still remain friends. You can talk honestly about it. Others maybe not, but there are some that do. I'm sure Noah had that. Can you imagine all the questions that would come to his own mind and the mind of his family being told, we're going to be here and everybody else is going to be out there? Can you imagine the questions that would come up? It took 100 years. At least what we do know is there was a 100-year block in which Noah was told to build the ark. Don't know if it took exactly 100 years, but it was in that time frame of 100 years when he's first told when God closes up the ark. 100 years goes by. Can you imagine the questions for 100 years to try and reconcile such a terrible judgment to come? When God begins His editing process in my life, the Bible calls it different things. It'll call it judgment, His discipline, His correction. There are three ways that we can live through this with confidence. The story of the flood and Noah's part that he played gets us in position for his restructuring. Now, the first we began a few weeks ago, let's just put this up on the screen again to remind ourselves. The first thing, we've already mentioned this, is that we have to prepare for it. It's pretty simple. You got to prepare for it the best way you can. Now, we don't always know when his correction starts, when he begins to judge something in my life. Don't always know when it starts. Now, for his part, Noah was given some specifics. He was given specifics as to the time in which it was going to take place, the severity of God's judgment, but that's not usually how it unfolds for us. But when we do catch on, and we will, when we do kind of stop and go, oh, wait a minute, I know God is doing something in my life. This is him at work right now. Prepare the best way that you can in your life. And you start in your preparation by first accepting it as needed. That's the first place. It has to be the primary place to prepare ourselves, to accept what he is doing in my life, that God is right in doing this. That's how my preparation begins. Noah needed something like this. In fact, God goes out of his way to convince Noah, to compel Noah. Not exactly sure what's the best word to describe that, but something compels him that what God was going to do was fully necessary. This is where we pick the story up in chapter 6 and verse 5. Now, we have to remember that as Moses is writing this, he's writing this during the wilderness wandering, so a lot of centuries have passed since this. Now, they would have oral tradition, but now it's being written down. The details are there. So what we're going to read in verse 5 is just kind of a general statement by God as to his intent of what he's doing with Noah and this coming flood. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Can you imagine that? And we're going to see this statement uttered once again after the entire flood takes place and they get off of the ark. When everything's washed clean, this statement comes up again. Verse 6, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things. Now that's going to be a key idea, that terminology there of creeping things. I'll just kind of, throw a little bit of this out there right now. This creeping things is a designation that appears when God creates the world. It's a designation of part of the creatures that go on board the ark. Creeping things includes dinosaurs. If God really did create everything in the beginning, if he really did create dinosaurs, that's when they were created. This is the category you find them in. So he's going to wipe them out along with the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. And then we know in verse 8 and 9 that he finds Noah blameless. Noah is someone who walked with God. Then in verse 13, now God is speaking to Noah. So God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. So therefore I want you to go out and build a big boat. So once he understands the righteous need for this cleansing, once we see God beginning to work forcefully in my life, though it may be very painful, and typically it is in some place in my life, here's what I need to do next. I need to position myself to let it happen without interference from me. Again, let's look up on the screen. The first step is that we prepare ourselves the best we can. The second is we have to permit God's cleansing in our lives. This is where my right response, this is where taking that path of righteousness will bring comfort. It'll allow my life and every crevice of my life to be thoroughly open to him. That's what I have to do. I have to stop and say, God, you know what? Check underneath here and look back here and look at the bottom of my foot. Check every crevice in my life you have to. The psalmist said that often. Oftentimes the psalmist would say things like, Lord, just reveal every wicked way to me. If there is something I'm holding back, something I've forgotten, bring it forward so I can confess it and I can get rid of it. Don't hold anything back. Give God permission to inspect and to investigate without opposition from you. See, this is where you can begin again. This is where you find hope. Now, of course, we certainly know that even in our greatest of resistances, God will still judge. But that's so much more worse for us. One of the best illustrations I can have in this, in fact, it's interesting to me since I've kind of gone back to babysitting, all of those things that we did in raising our own two daughters that I've long since forgotten have now come back to me again. And one of them, with the grandkids, is when they have colds. And when they have colds, now, I thought they would have better inventions. Maybe they do out there, but my daughters still have that ball that extracts the phlegm. You depress the ball, you stick it in the nostril. And to me, it never works. It never really worked for my own kids. I can't get it to work here. And my daughters always remind me, make sure you depress the ball before you stick it in their nose. Don't depress it while it's in their nose because you'll blow their brains out. So I don't think that's really going to happen. But it's scary enough, so I make sure. But you know what? Every time I do this, it's not like my grandson or granddaughter, they just kind of lie there. Just stick it in. They fight. They resist. The hands are up everywhere. The head is going back and forth. The legs are kicking. The body is twitching. They want to sit up. And you got the ball in one hand and this arm here, and it's like, no, I'm going to extract this. We're going to resist this cold right now, And it's about the time I wish I was an octopus. You need about 8 hands in order to hold them down. Can't get them to understand, look, if you just relax in me, just trust me, judging the cold will be so much better for you, and we can start this day all over again. This is the lesson of the flood. Sin, unchecked in its infancy, it'll grow, and it'll affect every aspect of our life. You can think of sin like this. Think about the early earth there. They're in that period of perfection. Think of sin in the early earth like this. About 6 years ago, I got poison oak. Now, I didn't even know there was such a thing as poison oak. I know what poison ivy is, and I'm not susceptible to poison ivy. I've been in poison ivy a dozen times in my life. I never get it. Apparently, I was in poison oak. I didn't know it. And somebody pointed out to me, and it started out with just 3 little dots on my arm. And they said, oh, yeah, that's poison oak. I go, well, that doesn't bother me. Poison ivy doesn't bother me. This doesn't bother me either. It itches a little bit. It's no big deal, It's not a problem. I mean, why should it be a problem? I mean, it's not. You see where I'm going with this, right? It was unchecked. I didn't do anything about it. I didn't take it seriously. Before I know it, it is spread all over my body. My face is like twice the size. It's like balloon size. I eventually had to go to the doctor. I had to get shots for this kind of thing. Sin in the early earth, after about 1,600 years, because that's about how much time has elapsed between Adam and Noah, about 1,600 years. By the time of Noah, it is spread unchecked everywhere. In fact, even to the extent where apparently there's demonic divine intervention in this as well. So God's judgment must be full and complete. And this has to be understood fully for this story to have merit in my life, so I can properly be prepared. Because if I'm not properly prepared, I most likely will not openly permit God to fully extract sin from my life. And I'll fight him. My hands will go up, and I'll rock my head back and forth, and I'll start kicking my legs. Because I just don't want him to do all that he wants to do. In the narrative here, Moses is going to use certain phrases that leave no doubt in our minds, or that of this wandering nation that he's writing to, that God's judgment must be complete. We pick the story up, move over to chapter 7 and verse 18. Look at some of the words that he uses. He says, the water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth. Now that word prevail there, you might have a different English word. Some words are more descriptive than others, but just keep that word in mind. The word prevail actually is a very good word to use, English word to use. The water prevailed, increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. And the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. And the water prevailed, again, third time here. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, Moses describes the water as prevailing upon the earth. Now, you might have a translation that says something like it rose or it came upon. And those words are fine. They're not wrong. But they're, unfortunately, with English words, some are not as descriptive as others. Because the original word that it's translating here is the word that means to conquer, to be superior, to be mighty in valor. Again, let's look up on the screen. It means that the waters, they did indeed rise, and we're told here by way of calculation that they rose anywhere between 15 cubits higher, which is anywhere between about 22 and 25 feet. in antiquity, they're not exactly sure if a cubit, and we'll talk about this in the weeks ahead, but they're not exactly sure if a cubit is 18 inches or 24 inches, but it seems like that's the boundary that they found. So even if you pick the most conservative number, 18 inches is a cubit, you're talking about the waters rising between 22 and 25 feet higher than the highest mountain at the time. Now I say at the time because we don't know what the highest mountain at the time was. It's not necessarily the case that Mount Everest existed prior to the flood, might have existed after the flood because there would be tectonic shifts taking place, volcanic worldwide tectonic shifts taking place, which we'll look at in a second here. So the waters did in fact rise, but when they were blocked, let's say, by a mountain range, the waters didn't just rise up around them, they conquered them. They broke through them. There's no such thing as a tranquil flood. This is exactly what God does to our sin. This is what gives greater meaning to the result of these prevailing waters. Let's pick it up again in verse 21. So that all flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts, and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth. There's that word again. There's that word again. Of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land. So this is how God prevailed against the wickedness of the world. And the depiction is intensified when you go back to verse 11, verse 12. It says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the seventh day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. The fountains of the deep. We're talking about huge bodies of water bursting forth under the surface of the land. And the floodgates, now look at that word there, and the floodgates of the sky were open. So the rain is more than just rain. We're talking about floodgates spreading across the land. So you've got underground water tables, perhaps the size of oceans, volcanically erupting across the globe. You're going to have tectonic shifts here. The continents that exist today probably aren't the continents that existed prior to the flood. You would have continents and land masses just reshaped, along with a worldwide, non-stop floodgate of rain for 40 days and 40 nights across the entire globe. Certainly these waters prevailed. These waters conquered for 150 days, as Moses again stresses in verse 24. The waters then took another 74 days. If you want to just turn over to chapter 8, I'm not going to read all these verses, but you can look at these verses as they make mention of them. The waters then took 74 days to decrease in verse 5 until only the tops of the new mountain ranges could be seen. And then in verse 6 and 7 of chapter 8, Noah waits another 40 days and he sends out the raven. And then we find in verse 8, he waits 7 more days and he sends out a dove. All this is in an effort to find dry land. In verse 10, it takes another 7 days when another dove is sent out. This time she returns with an olive leaf. Well, then he waits another 7 more days. In verse 12, and a third dove is sent out. This one does not return. Then in verse 13, 29 more days elapses before Noah removes the covering of the ark, which apparently is just some part of the roof that he's able to uncover and to look out. And this allows him to kind of survey the landscape out there. And then from there, another 57 days. In verse 14 through 16, another 57 days goes by before they actually leave the ark. So you add all that up. I don't expect anybody to remember all that, but you add all that up, and it's a total of 371 days that they are on board that floating barge. Again, if you want to look up on the screen here. You have 150 days of prevailing waters, waters that conquer 221 days for it to decrease. Now, those numbers are important, but it's not the numbers so much that tell the story as it is the process. God's judgment is so much more powerful than the sin that we have. Consider this whole account here. Consider that there was so much more water than needed to kill all of life. 22 to 25 feet higher than the highest mountain, whatever that was on planet Earth at that time. Now, nobody lives up here. No animals, no people. Most people are living down here. So you're talking about a massive amount of water in order to destroy all of life down here. So you've got massive amount of water taking place, so much more time than is needed. Did it really needed 150 days for all this prevailing waters? Couldn't all of life have been drowned and killed out in a day or two? But this is all what makes this restoration and this renewal richer and cleaner and fuller. We find in chapter 8 that all those birds that Noah sends out is just him testing the time. In effect, it's just him saying, now, God, it's kind of like the kid in the back of the seat. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Can we get off the ark now? No, not yet. Not yet. Just wait a little bit longer. So he sends out another set of birds. Can we go now? No, not yet. Not yet. See, believer, when we are under divine testing, divine renewal, relax in his care. Again, as we look up in the screen, prepare for the long ordeal the best you can. And the best way to do this is to permit him to finish it fully. You see, God himself made sure that the ark was filled with life and they were preserved through his judgment. While God is pressuring my life in order to rid my life of sin, he's also at the same time preserving my life, which means there's no further place I'm going to need to go for all of this to work in my life. So what I want to do is, this third step here is to persevere. Let's look up on the screen here again. Persevere in God's cleansing judgment. Because if you cave in now, if you cave in on this one, the process is going to need to start again in some other way, and those first two phases are going to have to be repeated all over again. Because this right here is a very dangerous time of all. At the point of your life being rebuilt and reshaped from sin's effects, the temptation to cave in is going to be the strongest, especially, now listen to this, especially when the painful correction is over. The temptation to fall is going to be the strongest. When you're getting off the ark, as it were. When the scrubbing and the cleansing is finished. And you're starting to feel good again about yourself. You're starting to feel alive and healthy. Falling to those former lusts and dependencies and weaknesses is going to rise again. So persevere. Noah, when you read this story, you can't deny he's been stupendous through all of what's been happening around him. And it's more than what any other human being really has had to face. But now comes the powerful peak to all the cleansing. Following the flood, here's his first response. We pick it up in chapter 8, down in verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. So they've gotten off the ark. First thing he does, Noah builds an altar to the Lord. And he took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings in the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. There it is again. Wait, I thought we had a fully cleansed world here. I thought everything was taken care of. Everything's been washed clean. God got out his big delete button and said, beep, yeah, we're starting all over again. And he says, yeah, we are. But the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. It will rise up again. But I'll never destroy every living thing as I have done here. Of course, he's going to destroy everything again. We know this from our Things to Come class, but he's not going to do it like this. So the first thing he does is he worships God, and God approves of this, and he blesses mankind. Chapter 9, verse 1, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, now here's a repeat, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Everything is right with the world. This judgment that I've just poured out will never be repeated. The whole earth is yours again. Let's do it right this time. Now, unfortunately, they don't have the benefit of perfection like they did 1,600 years ago, but hey, where did that get us, huh? But they do have the benefits of cleansing. And what's happening here in chapter 9, verse 1 and following is just all a restating of that original cultural mandate given in Genesis 1, that dominion mandate given to that first couple. But here this time, it includes a disclaimer. Evil is now present. And the dominion mandate over mankind now includes something else. We pick it up in verse 2. What does it now include that wasn't there in the past? Fear. The fear of you and the terror of you shall be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground. There it is again. There's that same term, everything that creeps on the ground. And all the fish of the sea, into your hand they are given. Terror and fear. See, this is why we put lions in cages and we don't just run up to them in the field and lay down and start, rolling around with them anymore. We don't do that. We capture them, we put them in cages here. And this now newly cleansed world arises an occasion for sin. Again, pick it up, verse 18, chapter 9, verse 18. Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. So all of a sudden, we've got a reference to a grandchild here. Now, we don't know how much time has elapsed by the time they get off the ark in these events here in verse 20, but apparently you can read this one of two ways. Either a baby has been born, and Ham has named his son Canaan, or Moses is just referencing the fact that Ham is going to have a son named Canaan, which isn't probably likely, because that's typically not how this kind of thing, this historical narrative is structured. It's not a prophecy here. It's just a real historical event that's taking place. So he has a son named Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. Now this is why I've always said, whenever talking about this kind of conversation, we as human beings today, we are directly related to Noah. We are indirectly related to Adam and Eve. So then Noah began farming, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself in his tent. Now what's taking place here, as we read this story, the first time I've read it, in fact when I still read it, I read something like this and I say, this is really foolish on Noah's part, but I don't think of this as being really terrible. But the problem here is it provides the access point for sin. It has an access point for sin, and its actualization comes next here. Because this whole scene here is really kind of strange to our Western morals and the way that our minds think in our Western world. Here's what it leads to. We pick it up in verse 22. Ham, the father of Canaan, which again, historical narrative, it means this baby most likely has been born. Ham sees the nakedness of his father. Now, he doesn't do anything about it. There's kind of a gap here between this and the next statement. He sees the nakedness of his father, but he goes outside and he tells his two brothers about it. But Shem and Japheth, they took a garment, they laid it upon their shoulders, they walked backwards so they couldn't see, and they covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away so they did not see their father's nakedness. Now when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." Now again, I read something like this, and I think to myself, this whole episode seems more like an embarrassment than it does sin. But in Eastern culture, things are a little bit different. Well, they're kind of different in Western culture in some of these ways as well, but especially in Eastern culture, especially at this time. To view a father in some kind of a compromising situation and to not do anything about it, to not try to maintain and cover up his dignity, as it were, but to go out and to share the offense is considered a total disgrace. Now, we don't have a whole lot of details here. Ham discovers his dad naked. His son Canaan may or may not have been with him at the time. We don't know. But there seems to have been something that Ham said to his brothers that was either unflattering or disrespectful or both. So rather than just kind of him accidentally walking into the tent and finding his father naked there, what he does, and trying to cover him up, what he does is he goes out and he shares it and probably says something disparaging to them. He does nothing to protect the dignity of his dad, but the brothers do. And they do it in a way to protect their own dignity as well. So we find out that when Noah wakes up, he finds out what happens. And notice what he does here. He curses Ham's son, Canaan. Now, the best way that I can understand something like this is that Noah considers himself to have been disgraced by his own son. So the curse is such that Ham will now be disgraced by his own son. And what this begins to return to in this new world are those two contending kingdoms that which we talked about prior to this whole incident of the flood, something that took place just after the fall into sin. The world builders and the kingdom builders. Pick it up in verse 25. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." We find out from history here that the Canaanites became just that. They became continual enemies of Israel. In fact, at a couple times, David put them under subjection. Joshua put them under subjection. Solomon put them under subjection. See, these are the people that represent the world builders. But the descendants of Shem and Japheth, they represent the kingdom builders. Now, we're going to continue this story next week, and a couple weeks after that as well. As I said, there's going to be kind of a sidebar here. But let's try to make a relevant connection to this. Let's look up on the screen here. All of this reminds us that new beginnings, starting over, is always real. It's always there, but never without its complications and infections. Think about this. Even with an entire world washed clean, the infection of sin quickly rises for Noah and his family. And it will be for us too. You're looking to start over after some failing in your own life. If you've been on that path for a while, and you're saying to yourself, it's time, I need to have something done to my life, get it done. Allow God to cleanse your life. But when you think about what's happened in the past in your life, keep the past in the past. And what I mean by that is I'm not referencing the idea that you should forget about the sin. We can't really do that. And in fact, it's kind of redeeming. It's a part of our testimony when we're sharing with somebody else who is struggling with something in life. They don't know Christ, and they think to themselves, man, I'm just so bad, God can't save me. And you say, well, wait a minute. Let me tell you about this part of my life back here. That's an important part of our story. It's an important part of our message to let them know, yes, God can save you. But what you don't want to do is take any trips down the memory lane of guilt. Guilt is what is dealt with. I can't forget what I've done, but what I also don't forget is God's forgiven this. And He's washed it clean. And it's a great part of my testimony that God is so powerful. Look what He can do in my life. But Satan will do everything that he can to convince you that your issues, that your sin with God are unresolved. Don't buy into that. It's simply not true if you have confessed them and you walk with Him in righteousness. But certainly it's not going to be obstruction-free. Now again, as we consider the next couple of weeks, the flood of Noah, as I've said several times, is a watershed event in all of human history. It's a watershed event geologically, by how we properly understand the physical makeup of our world today. Evolution will tell you that the things the way they are now is the way they've always been in the past. Nothing's ever changed. If a fossil is found in a plot of dirt somewhere, it's been in that plot of dirt for millions of years. And we say, no, it hasn't been. It's been washed around probably the entirety of this planet. So it changes the way that we look at our world geologically and how we properly understand its physical makeup. It changes the way that we look at the world archaeologically, because now, as I said, all fossils, all finds cannot be dated beyond Noah's Ark. If God is true, if He really existed, if He really did bring a worldwide flood, if it really was all the details that we saw, those fossils have been jumbled up across this planet because of that. It's a watershed event anthropologically, because it reveals the true dispersion of the nations of people. We find within 200 years after Noah, what do we have? The next great event. The next great event that gets God mad, the Tower of Babel. God has told them here, it's the second time He's told them, go out, populate the earth, have dominion over the earth. Everything is yours. But what do they do 200 years later? They're all trying to build this big ziggurat. And really, it's so much more than that. It's a pretty complicated structure they're building here because they want to keep everyone together. And we know the story. God comes down, confuses their language. There are 10 tables of nations that spread out upon the earth. All cultures around the world come from these 10 tables of nations. If God really does exist, if He really did reveal Himself in His Word, and if Genesis really is true history. When you think about today what we would call primitive peoples who are not culturally astute, maybe like in America or Europe or something like this, what we would call pagans, maybe that's a word that's often used. Those people are not the way they are because they haven't caught up evolutionary. They're the way they are because at one time their ancestors who came from Babel spread out, in a sense, devolved into this. So it changes the way we look at the world anthropologically. It changes the way we look at the world theologically. We learn that God will judge seriously when sin is left unchecked. But we also learn that he is eternal in grace as the ark is provided for those who respond. And then perhaps what is of importance to us today, it's a watershed event spiritually. Because we learn the fundamental truth of the flood. It's not a story to condemn or to make one think that God will give up on you. Because it's easy to read the story and think that it's not the case at all. The lesson of the flood is that it is never too late to start over this side of heaven. Let's close in prayer. Let me invite you to stand together also. Our Father and our God, we do thank you. When we look at something like the flood of Noah, it's a powerful story in the Old Testament. It carries with it a lot of consequences, Lord, a lot of destruction, and certainly a lot of death. I don't know of any other story in the Bible that depicts more forcefully, except maybe outside of those end-time events, of what you do when you bring judgment upon sin, Lord. But nothing else brings more powerfully to our minds and to our hearts the grace and the mercy you pour out as that ark is provided for anyone who wanted to come on board. And we know that that ark is depicted more fully, more forcefully in the cross of Jesus Christ. Anyone can come to the cross. It's never filled up. There's never too many people for your grace, Lord God. It's always fully shed upon us, God. We thank you for that. Our Lord and our God, help us to remember this, especially when we're fighting dark times in our lives, especially when we're fighting turmoil, especially when we're fighting something, Lord God, that seems to be compelling us to unrighteousness, that we are able to look at this and say, you know what? I can start again. I can get clean. That big delete button can be pushed, and my life can be made right with you. God, thank you for that. Where would we be without this, God? We give you praise for this, Father, because we know that it can only be done by the power and the promise and the blood of Jesus Christ. It's in his name we pray. Amen.